All right, this lesson is intended for use with the cultural identity essay that 10th graders are writing this year. But in general, this is all just good writing advice. So we're going to be talking about personalizing your writing, but it doesn't have to be used with just writing an essay. It could be used literally with any type of writing, narrative writing, uh, you know, creative, poetic writing. All of this advice works um, with different types of writing. So remember that these notes are required, and I will be checking them when they are due. So make sure that you have them. We have several goals today. The first are objectives. The first objective is for you to be able to understand how to begin showing in your writing rather than telling, which is something that you may have already heard about in a previous lesson. If it is, this will give you a little bit more detail on it. If not, this is your introduction to it. Second objective is for you to understand one strategy for adding variety to your sentence structures. So how to change up the types of sentences that you're writing and add a bit of voice to your writing. Third, you need to understand how metaphors can strengthen your writing, um, which is just a good strategy for lots of different types of writing. And finally, as you're taking notes on these things, you should be thinking about how do I apply these strategies to my own writing, which should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, just because it's important for you to consider, okay, I'm learning this thing, how can I do it in my own writing? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is showing our experiences rather than telling them. And really the main way that we show rather than tell is that we get rid of dead or overused verbs. So we look at what we've written and we look to see if verbs like these are showing up over and over and over. So verbs like is, are, were, am, has, have, had, be, been, look, take, took, make, run, ran, go, went, gone, do, did, came, come. All of those are verbs that if you're using them, you can use them once in a while, but a lot of times they show up over and over and over in our writing. And we end up when we use these verbs with sentences that look something like this. It says, Harry Potter was going to Hagrid's hut to have a snack when he ran into his enemy, Draco Malfoy. This is an example of a telling sentence. So by using verbs like was going, have, and ran, it's not that we don't know what's going on. It's just that we don't have a really clear picture of how those things are happening. It's just kind of like, oh, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's a boring sentence. Um, if we were to use lively, original, imaginative verbs that force us to describe what's going on and how things are happening, then we might end up with something a little bit more creative, a little bit more of a picture that creates a little bit more of a picture in the reader's mind. So these are verbs that convey action, and like I said, they paint pictures with the words that you're using. So if we change the sentence on the left from telling to showing, we might end up with something more like this. Bounding down the castle steps, his stomach lurching with hunger as he imagined the taste of the snacks he would enjoy with his friend Hagrid, Harry skidded to a sudden halt inches from the sneering face of his nemesis, Draco Malfoy. And in this case, by forcing ourselves to think about what verbs we're using, not only are those verbs putting pictures in our minds, but they're also forcing the writer to continue on and describe a little bit more about the situation. So we get a much clearer picture of what's going on. It also notice that the personality and the tone of the sentence is much more apparent. It feels like a person is saying this, is describing this. They have some skin in the game. The only thing you want to do is make sure that when you're replacing those dead verbs with the imaginative ones, that your tone remains appropriate for the audience and the purpose. And then the other thing that we need to remember is that we want to avoid what's called thesaurus alert. So never use words that you wouldn't normally use, because then it's just going to stick out. The reader's going to say, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like something the author would say. So you need to stay within words that you know, but I'm sure that you know many more imaginative verbs than the dead ones that are listed on the left. Second piece of advice is about how to add some flow to your writing, and also how to pick up again that personality in your writing, and that has to do with starting your sentences differently. A lot of us start our sentences in one particular way, and that is with a subject verb. So we don't always want to start our sentences with the subject verb. If you look at the example sentence, all of the sentences are going to go with this picture off on the left. The example sentence is a subject verb. It says, Hermione glared at Ron over her book. The Hermione being the subject, the verb being glared. So that's a standard subject verb sentence. And we usually default to these sentences when we're speaking and when we're writing. What we want to do is maybe change it up a little bit, because it makes our writing much more original, or much more personal. So there's a few ways that you can do that. First, you can try reversing the sentence. So taking the end of the sentence and moving it to the beginning, you end up with, if you look at the sentence above and compare it to the sentence below, we've taken over her book and moved it to the beginning. So it says, over her book, Hermione glared at Ron, which just adds a little bit of color to the way that the sentence is written. The subject and the verb come a little bit later. We get a little bit of description of how this is happening first. Another way to change it up is to use what's called an infinitive phrase as your subject. So in this case, it says, to avoid studying, Harry rested the book on his face. And the subject is rather than just being the person, the subject is why the person is doing this. So we also have to, we call this an infinitive phrase because it has a to at the beginning. So to avoid is the verb, but the verb is in an infinitive tense, which means that it could happen anytime. So that's why we call this an infinitive phrase. So if we start infinitive phrases, making infinitive phrases our subjects, it forces us to write our sentences slightly differently and add a little bit more description to what's going on. Another way to change up the beginnings of our sentences is to begin with an adjective. So you can start with describing somebody or something rather than just starting with who they are. So this one says, bored, Ron put off studying by trying to catch a frog in his mouth, which is an interesting thing to do, I suppose. But we start knowing that he's bored, all right? We start with this adjective rather than just saying, Ron put off studying by trying to catch a frog in his mouth. We know a little bit more about why he's doing that before we even get into the subject and the verb. We can also start with an adverb. So instead of an adjective, we can start with an adverb, which tells us about how something is being done. So in this sentence, it says, grumpily, Hermione continued reading. And adverbs are words that describe how verbs are happening. So where adjectives describe a noun, adverbs describe a verb. And in this case, reading is the verb that is being described grumpily. We could have said the sentence, Hermione continued reading grumpily. But if we move that grumpily to the beginning, it adds a little bit more personality to how the sentence is being said. And then finally, we can begin with an ing or an ed, what's called a participial phrase. So if we look at these two examples, they say, having drooled all over the page, Harry couldn't read the book anyway. So, starting with the ing, right, having drooled all over the page. So again, it's kind of describing why Harry can't read the book, but we've moved it up there to the beginning. We could have just said, Harry couldn't read the book having drooled all over the page. But that's, again, just the subject-verb version, right? We've decided on what our ing description can be, and we've moved it to the beginning of the sentence. Or we could say, I'm sure you've already read this sentence, but it says, Frustrated with her friend's apathy, Hermione could hardly focus. Again, we could have said Hermione could hardly focus because she was frustrated with her friend's apathy, but look at how the sentence is actually shorter when we move that part of the sentence, the end part of the sentence to the beginning, and we start with that ed phrase that describes why Hermione is unable to focus, right? So because she's frustrated with her friend's apathy. So those are some strategies for starting your sentences differently, and I hope that you attempt to use a few of them. But you'll notice it makes a magical difference in your writing. The last piece of advice for this is just always have a variety of long, medium, and short sentences. So think about if you have a long sentence, maybe you should punctuate it with a couple of short ones or some medium sentences, or vice versa. If you always write short sentences, then write a couple long ones, and that will also help add some flow to your writing and personality to your writing, in addition to starting your sentences differently. Finally, one last and the most complex piece of advice for improving your writing is using extended metaphors. So just to review, something that I hope you already know is that a metaphor compares two unlike things without using the words like or as. So an example of that would be saying this: reading all 7 Harry Potter books as a kid was a journey that took me the better part of a year, and the path along that journey taught me a lot about the importance of friendship. So the basic metaphor here is that we've got a journey. We're talking about reading the books being a journey. We've also got a second metaphor that the path is what's teaching me something, the path on this journey. But that second metaphor relies on the first metaphor. So, we have a journey, there's a path along that journey. We've got 2 metaphors, but one relies on the other. So that's a basic metaphor. What I'm saying is try to use an extended metaphor. An extended metaphor is when you use and build upon a metaphor that you start with at the beginning and you take it to the end. So through an entire paragraph, not just a sentence of a metaphor, but a paragraph of a metaphor, or even better, an entire essay of a metaphor. So if we think back, we actually have an example of this from something that we've read earlier in the year, and that is this. It says, in the essay Ethnic Hash by Patricia Williams, a mishmash of different foods thrown together as one meal, also known as a hash, expresses how her own culture arises from a mishmash of ethnic backgrounds. Throughout the entire essay, a mishmash of foods are described, each one from a different culture, to emphasize the similarity of her ethnic identity to a hash. So that's a complex thought, right? But if you think back to that, you can remember the entire essay was about food and different types of food. There's a type of food called a hash, and she describes all the different types of food for all her different ethnic identities, and she basically throws them all into this essay just like a hash. So her essay is as much a hash of her ethnicities as the types of food she's describing as being hashes. And I know that's really tough for some people to kind of grasp onto, but think about just if that's too complex, think about, if you're going to use, if we go back up to the first example, if we're going to use the metaphor of a journey, and I were going to write an essay about, my experience reading Harry Potter, then through the entire essay, I could continue to come back to this idea of the journey, or I could continue to come back to this idea of the path that I'm following along that journey. So those are 2 examples of how to use an extended metaphor, the more complex one being the one that's written on the screen, and the simpler one being the one that I just said to you. But just as a reminder, because I forgot about this arrow, the extended metaphor within this essay or this paragraph down here says the extended metaphor equals ethnicity as a hash. So again, think about how you might be able to work those into your own writings. And if you have questions about that, you can ask me, because I know that some of you might still be a little bit confused about what I mean by that. All right, have a good evening, and I'll see these notes tomorrow.